Johnny Carson's 10 biggest regrets, finally revealed. For 30 years, Johnny Carson invited America into their living rooms, his wry smile and gentle interviewing style making him feel like family to millions. As host of The Tonight Show, he crafted a public persona so seamless that viewers felt they knew him intimately, but behind the charming exterior and famous golf swing, Carson harbored deep regrets that he took to his grave. Johnny was the most private superstar who ever lived, revealed a longtime NBC executive who worked closely with Carson for over a decade. What audiences saw was just the surface, a carefully constructed version of himself that hid the disappointments and mistakes that haunted him until the end. Today, we're revealing the 10 biggest regrets that Johnny Carson never publicly acknowledged, private sorrows and professional missteps that shaped the real man behind the television legend. These aren't tabloid rumors, but confirmed accounts from those closest to him, producers, writers, family members, and confidants who witnessed firsthand the moments that Carson later wished he could change. But first, we need to understand why Carson's most painful regret affected him so deeply, and why the television icon who brought joy to millions spent his final years in increasing isolation, unable to reconcile his public success with his private failures.
Why, my next guest, Joan Rivers, whom I don't think is going to look when she comes out like she does on the back of the cover. Would you welcome Miss Joan Rivers?
1. Freezing out. Joan Rivers. She was his permanent guest host for years, until she got her own show on Fox. Carson never spoke to her again. His regret. Multiple sources close to Carson later said he regretted how cold and final his reaction was, especially after Joan's husband died by suicide. He refused to take her calls. It wasn't business anymore. It was personal, and it stayed personal until the end. For years, Joan Rivers was Carson's most reliable substitute, stepping in whenever the host took one of his frequent vacations. Their on-air chemistry delighted audiences, with Carson seemingly genuinely tickled by Rivers' razor-sharp wit. Behind the scenes, their relationship appeared equally warm, with Carson often mentoring Rivers on the finer points of hosting. The betrayal, as Carson saw it, came in 1986, when Rivers accepted an offer to host The Late Show on the fledgling Fox network, without telling Carson first. According to Carson's longtime producer Fred DeCordova, Johnny learned about Joan's show from Fox's press release, not from Joan herself. It felt like the ultimate betrayal. Carson's response was swift and absolute. He immediately blacklisted Rivers from The Tonight Show and refused all her attempts at reconciliation. Even after Rivers' husband Edgar Rosenberg died by suicide in 1987, a tragedy that might have softened most grudges, Carson remained unmoved. Joan called Johnny after Edgar's death, hoping he might at least express condolences, revealed a former NBC page who later worked for Rivers. He wouldn't take the call. She never stopped trying to make amends, right up until Carson's retirement. In her later years, Rivers spoke openly about the falling out, expressing regret for not handling it differently, while also noting the disproportionate nature of Carson's reaction. "I was hurt that he never called or sent a note when Edgar died," Rivers told interviewers. "That wasn't about business anymore." According to several sources close to Carson, in his final years, he privately expressed regret at the absoluteness of his reaction, acknowledging that while the professional slight was real, his response had been unnecessarily cruel. By then, however, it was too late for reconciliation. Rivers remained banned from The Tonight Show until Jimmy Fallon finally welcomed her back in 2014, 9 years after Carson's death.
You've got to remember something, Eileen. There's something called kidding on the square. Divorce is very painful for Johnny. He's a very sensitive man.
2. Marrying Joanna Holland. Without a prenup, Johnny surprised her with marriage papers on their anniversary. 3 years later, she surprised him with divorce papers and walked away with over $20 million. His regret, privately told Ed McMahon he should have never married anyone without a lawyer in the room. Carson's third marriage exemplified the impulsive romantic decisions that repeatedly cost him emotionally and financially. On September 30th, 1972, he surprised Holland, a model he'd been dating for several years, with marriage papers during what she thought was simply an anniversary celebration. It was classic Johnny, simultaneously romantic and reckless, explained Carson's attorney Henry Bushkin in his memoir. He didn't consult anyone, didn't have his lawyers draft any kind of prenuptial agreement. He just decided to get married and did it. The marriage lasted 9 years before Holland filed for divorce in 1983. The settlement was, at the time, one of Hollywood's most expensive, approximately $20 million in cash and property, including their Bel Air home and a portfolio of stocks and investments. What made the financial hit particularly painful for Carson was its repetitive nature. His second wife, Joanne Copeland, had also received a substantial settlement after their 1972 divorce. By the time his third marriage ended, Carson had surrendered nearly $30 million to ex-wives, a fact that reportedly caused him considerable bitterness. After the Holland divorce, Johnny became much more cynical about relationships, noted a Tonight Show writer who worked closely with Carson during this period. He'd make these cutting jokes about marriage during the monologue that weren't in the script. You could tell they came from a place of genuine anger. Ed McMahon later recalled a conversation with Carson shortly after the divorce was finalized. Johnny told me, "Ed, never marry anyone without a lawyer in the room. Love fades, but alimony is forever." This sardonic view would inform Carson's approach to his fourth and final marriage to Alexis Moss in 1987, which was preceded by a detailed prenuptial agreement and lasted until his death. 3. Alienating his son. Rick, Carson's youngest son Rick, had a troubled life, struggling with mental illness, multiple DUIs, and was once committed involuntarily. Carson kept distance. His regret. Rick died in a car crash in 1991. Carson rarely spoke about it publicly, but insiders say it devastated him, and that he regretted not doing more as a father. Johnny Carson's public persona as America's affable host contrasted sharply with his reputation as a distant, often absent father to his 3 sons from his first marriage to Jody Wolcott. Of these strained relationships, his connection with his youngest son Rick was perhaps the most troubled and ultimately the most tragic. Rick Carson struggled with mental health issues throughout his adult life, including reported diagnoses of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. His difficulties manifested in increasingly erratic behavior, multiple arrests for driving under the influence, and at least one involuntary psychiatric hospitalization in the 1980s. Johnny was completely ill-equipped to handle Rick's problems, revealed a family friend who knew both men. He grew up in that Midwestern stoic tradition where you didn't discuss feelings, and you certainly didn't acknowledge mental illness, so he just withdrew. This emotional distance created a painful cycle. As Rick's behavior became more concerning, Carson pulled further away, unable or unwilling to engage with problems he didn't understand and couldn't control. According to those who knew the family, Carson's response to Rick's struggles typically involved sending money rather than offering personal support. Johnny's solution to any family problem was to write a check, explained a longtime associate. He wasn't cold-hearted. He just had no emotional tools to deal with something as complex as mental illness, so he retreated into work and let his lawyer handle the practical matters. The tragic culmination came on June 21st, 1991, when Rick Carson died when his car plunged down an embankment near Morro Bay, California. He was 39. Johnny Carson briefly acknowledged the loss on The Tonight Show, thanking fans for their condolences before quickly returning to the regular format. Privately, however, friends reported that Carson was devastated, haunted by what might have been different had he been more present in his son's life. After Rick's death, Johnny would sometimes mention him after having a few drinks, recalled a close friend. He'd say things like, "I should have done more," or "I didn't know how to help him." It was one of the few times I ever saw Johnny express genuine regret.
Richard Pryor's here tonight. He is really,
4. Ignoring Richard Pryor. Pryor was one of the greatest comedians alive, yet Carson rarely booked him. The reason? Too unpredictable, NBC execs said. His regret, Johnny later acknowledged that Pryor was one of the best we ever had, and insiders say Carson admitted he mishandled it. Throughout the 1970s, Richard Pryor revolutionized American comedy with his raw, unflinching examinations of race, sex, and power. Critics hailed him as a genius. Fellow comedians studied his technique, and his concert films broke box office records. Yet during this period of creative brilliance, Pryor was noticeably absent from The Tonight Show, the most important platform for stand-up comedians. It was an open secret in the comedy world that Carson was uncomfortable with Pryor's material, explained a talent coordinator who worked for the show during this period. Johnny appreciated technical skill in comedy, timing, delivery, structure, but Pryor's raw, profane style made him nervous, both as a performer and as someone responsible for a mainstream network show. The few times Pryor did appear on The Tonight Show, The results were tense and uneven. Network censors required heavy editing of his material, producers worried about potential outbursts, and Carson himself seemed unable to establish the easy rapport he enjoyed with more conventional comedians. Johnny liked being in control of his show, and Pryor was fundamentally uncontrollable, noted a writer who worked with both men. It wasn't personal or even about race specifically. Johnny just didn't want surprises, and Pryor was all about surprising audiences with uncomfortable truths. As Pryor's health declined in the 1980s, and his cultural impact became undeniable, Carson reportedly began to reconsider his approach. In private conversations with staff, and in at least one industry interview, he acknowledged Pryor as one of the best we ever had, and expressed regret at not featuring him more prominently during his prime years. A producer who worked on Carson's final seasons recalled, "Around 1990, Johnny actually said to me, 'We should have found a way to showcase Richard more often.' That was a mistake." Coming from Johnny, who rarely admitted error, that was significant. By the time Carson made this realization, however, Pryor's multiple sclerosis had progressed significantly, limiting his performing capabilities. The opportunity to fully showcase one of comedy's greatest voices on television's biggest stage had been lost, a professional misjudgment that Carson later recognized as a significant regret of his career.
I wish you luck, John. I think it's time you moved on.
I think so.
I'm not saying that facetiously.
I'm not retiring. I'm just stepping down as the host of this show.
5. Never reconnecting with Don Rickles. Rickles was a regular in the early years, but drifted away after crossing a personal line on air. Carson never quite forgave him. His regret: in later years, Carson reportedly tried to patch things up off camera, but the warmth never returned. It haunted him. Don Rickles and Johnny Carson shared an electric on-screen chemistry that produced some of The Tonight Show's most memorable moments. Rickles' mock insult comedy perfectly complemented Carson's straight man reactions, creating a dynamic that delighted audiences. Behind the scenes, however, their relationship gradually cooled following an incident that crossed Carson's carefully maintained boundaries between his public and private lives. Johnny compartmentalized his life completely, explained a longtime Tonight Show producer. There was Carson the host, who could take a joke about anything, and Carson the private citizen, who was incredibly sensitive about certain topics, especially his divorces and family issues. The pivotal moment came during a 1970s appearance when Rickles made an unscripted joke about Carson's recent divorce and alimony payments, touching precisely on the personal matters Carson considered off-limits. While Carson laughed it off on camera, backstage he was reportedly furious, feeling Rickles had deliberately violated their unspoken boundaries. Johnny didn't shout or make a scene. That wasn't his style, recalled a staff writer present that night. He just went cold, and Rickles knew immediately he'd made a mistake. While Rickles continued to appear on The Tonight Show, the frequency of his visits decreased, and the genuine warmth that had characterized their earlier interactions noticeably diminished. Carson's responses became more measured, his laughter less spontaneous, and the playful antagonism that had once seemed so natural became increasingly forced. In later years, as both men aged and Carson approached retirement, he reportedly made overtures toward reconciliation. Johnny invited Don to dinner a couple of times in the late 80s, revealed a mutual friend. They were cordial, but that special connection they'd had was gone. Johnny once told me, "I wish I hadn't let that one joke change things, but I did." The regret was reportedly mutual. After Carson's death, Rickles spoke warmly of their history together while acknowledging the distance that had developed. Johnny was the best, but he could hold a grudge like nobody else, Rickles told an interviewer. "Once you were in the doghouse, it was hard to get out, and I spent a lot of years in that doghouse."
Still in the United States, where millions have just witnessed the end of a television era. Johnny Carson, for 30 years, host to the popular Tonight Show.
6. His cold exit from television. When Carson left The Tonight Show in 1992, he refused almost all interviews, tributes, or public appearances. His regret: privately said the goodbye felt empty. He later told a friend, "I should have given people more of a thank you." After 3 decades as America's most trusted late-night companion, Johnny Carson's final broadcast of The Tonight Show on May 22, 1992, was watched by over 50 million people. The episode featured a heartfelt farewell from the usually reserved host, who told his audience, "I can only tell you that it has been an honor and a privilege to come into your homes all these years." What surprised many was what followed this emotional goodbye: almost complete silence. Carson declined virtually all interview requests, refused to participate in NBC's transition programming, and turned down numerous offers for retrospectives and tribute specials. The man who had been in American living rooms 5 nights a week for 30 years simply disappeared. Johnny thought a clean break was best, explained his longtime executive producer Peter Lassley. He believed in leaving the stage before people started wishing you would, but I think he underestimated how abrupt it would feel, both to the public and to himself. According to those close to Carson, this swift departure left him with a sense of incompletion that he found difficult to articulate. While he had no regrets about retiring, the manner of his exit, without properly acknowledging the staff, crew, and network that had been part of his professional life for decades, began to trouble him. About 6 months after retiring, Johnny told me, "I think I should have done more to thank everyone properly," recalled a close friend. He realized that by declining all the tributes and retrospectives, he'd missed the chance to publicly acknowledge the hundreds of people who made the show possible. This sense of an incomplete goodbye reportedly contributed to Carson's increasing isolation and retirement. Without the formal closure that a more extensive farewell might have provided, he struggled to fully transition from public figure to private citizen. Johnny once said to me, "I left the party without saying goodbye properly, and now it feels too late to go back," revealed a former writer who maintained contact with Carson after his retirement. I think that's why he remained so reluctant to make public appearances later on. He felt the moment for a proper thank you had passed, and he regretted that.
With a question here, just how pissed off are you?
7. Trusting NBC. Too much. NBC refused to give Carson full control of The Tonight Show for decades. They also tried replacing him multiple times. His regret, he once said, "You give a network your life and they still keep a knife for your back pocket." He wished he'd gone independent sooner. Johnny Carson's relationship with NBC spanned 30 years and made both the man and the network enormous amounts of money. Yet behind the profitable partnership lay tensions and power struggles that Carson would later regret not addressing more forcefully earlier in his career. Johnny was the goose laying golden eggs, but NBC never fully trusted him with the nest, explained a former network executive who worked closely with Carson's production team. They kept control over many aspects of the show much longer than made sense given Johnny's track record. The most significant point of contention was ownership. Unlike modern late-night hosts who typically own their shows through production companies, Carson spent the first 2 decades of his tenure as essentially an NBC employee. It wasn't until 1981 that he gained ownership of The Tonight Show and formed Carson Productions to control the program, a move that he later said should have happened far earlier. Johnny told me that waiting until he was in his mid-50s to take control of his own show was his biggest business regret, recalled his attorney Henry Bushkin. He calculated he'd left at least $100 million on the table by not pushing for ownership in the 1960s. Adding to this frustration was Carson's awareness that NBC had repeatedly explored replacing him during contract negotiations. Network memos uncovered years later revealed serious discussions about grooming other hosts, approaching different talents, and developing contingency plans for Carson's departure, even during periods when he was delivering record ratings. Johnny found out in the late 80s that NBC had been in talks with other potential hosts during nearly every contract cycle, said a producer who worked on the show's final years. It felt like a betrayal after all he'd done for the network. He told me, "You give a network your life, and they still keep a knife for your back pocket." This distrust ultimately influenced Carson's handling of his succession. When it came time to name his replacement, Carson reportedly favored David Letterman, but made no public endorsement and exerted minimal influence over the decision, a hands-off approach he later regretted as NBC selected Jay Leno instead. In his final years, Johnny often said he should have gone independent much sooner and exerted more control over his legacy, revealed a close associate. He wished he'd understood earlier that networks have no loyalty, only interests.
And, see, that's the way this works. I have to explain. You said you've never done one of these kind of shows.
No, I have not.
See, the idea is I ask a question.
There is no...
8. Souring. On Chevy Chase, Chase bombed as a guest, and Carson never invited him back. He also made a joke that Carson took as an insult. His regret. Sources say Carson later admitted he may have been too hard on Chevy, even if Chase was a pain in the ass. When Chevy Chase appeared on The Tonight Show in the late 1970s, at the height of his post-Saturday Night Live film career, the interview should have been a classic meeting of comedy minds. Instead, it became one of the most awkward and tense guest spots in the show's history. and led to a permanent ban that Carson would later question. It was a disaster from the moment Chevy walked out, recalled a camera operator who worked that night. He came across as arrogant, unprepared, and worst of all, for a comedian, not funny. Johnny's smile got tighter and tighter as the segment went on. The uncomfortable interview culminated when Chase made what appeared to be an unscripted joke about Carson's multiple divorces, hitting precisely the personal territory that Carson considered off-limits for on-air discussion. Though Carson maintained his composure on camera, backstage he reportedly declared that Chase would never be invited back. Adding to the tension was a perceived competitive dynamic. Chase had been widely described in the press as the next Johnny Carson, a label that reportedly irritated Carson, who was sensitive to any suggestion that he was past his prime or being replaced by younger talent. Johnny didn't mind competition, but he hated entitlement, explained a talent booker who worked for the show during this period. He felt Chevy came in with this attitude that he was already on Johnny's level when he hadn't put in the work or proven himself over time. The ban remained in effect for the remainder of Carson's tenure, with Chase never again appearing on The Tonight Show while Carson hosted. However, in later years, Carson reportedly expressed to friends that his reaction may have been disproportionate to the offense. In the mid-90s, after he'd retired, Johnny mentioned that he probably should have given Chevy another chance, revealed a longtime friend. He said something like, "Chevy was a pain in the ass, but I could have been bigger about it. Everyone has a bad night." This reconsideration reflected Carson's post-retirement tendency to look back on his career with a more forgiving perspective, recognizing that some of his stronger reactions had been influenced by the immense pressure of maintaining his position as television's most powerful personality.
Good evening. I'm Johnny Carson. I'm going to bring you a safe and sane fourth tonight, because the monologue is a dud.
9. Not supporting more women. Joan Rivers wasn't the only woman Carson blocked. He also refused to book up-and-coming female comics for years. His regret, privately told a producer in the 90s, "We missed a lot of good ones." I was wrong about what the audience wanted. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, The Tonight Show was criticized for its lack of female comedians beyond the occasionally featured Joan Rivers and Phyllis Diller. While male comics routinely used Carson's show as a launching pad to stardom, women comedians found the door largely closed, a policy that Carson later acknowledged as a significant professional misjudgment. Johnny had this fixed idea about what his middle American audience would accept, explained a former talent coordinator for the show. He believed they wanted pretty, non-threatening women and funny men. Female comics who pushed boundaries made him uncomfortable because he thought they'd alienate his core viewers. This perspective resulted in the show overlooking a generation of groundbreaking female comedians. Performers like Elaine Boozler, Sandra Bernhard, and Paula Poundstone, all now recognized as significant voices in comedy, were rarely if ever featured on The Tonight Show during their formative years. There was an unofficial quota system, recalled a writer who worked on the show in the early 1980s. We might book one female comic a month, if that. Johnny would review the tapes and almost always pass. His standard comment was, "The audience isn't ready for this." The policy began to shift slightly in the late 1980s as Carson's attitudes evolved and as competition from other late-night shows forced The Tonight Show to reconsider its booking practices. However, the change came too late for many female performers whose careers had already been shaped by their exclusion from television's most important comedy platform. After his retirement, Carson reportedly expressed regret about this aspect of his legacy. Around 1995, Johnny told me, "We missed a lot of good ones. I was wrong about what the audience wanted," revealed a producer who maintained contact with Carson after he left the show. He had been watching some of these women on HBO and realized they were exactly what his show should have been featuring years earlier. This belated recognition reflected Carson's complex relationship with changing social norms. While personally traditional in many ways, he was capable of acknowledging when his judgments had been misguided, though these realizations often came too late to benefit the performers his policies had affected.
Love is in the air today. Valentine's Day. But remember, before you fall head over heels.
10. Spending too much time alone. By the late 90s, Carson was reclusive, rarely leaving Malibu. Friends said he declined party invites, reunions, even honors. His regret. In his final years, he wrote a letter to a producer that read, "I made millions laugh, but most nights I sat by myself." After 3 decades as America's most welcomed guest, Johnny Carson retreated into near-complete seclusion following his retirement from The Tonight Show. His Malibu compound became something of a fortress, with Carson rarely venturing out and seldom welcoming visitors. As his isolation deepened over the 1990s and early 2000s, those close to him began to recognize signs that Carson himself was questioning this extreme withdrawal. Johnny created this perfect bubble for himself, beautiful home, amazing views, complete privacy, and then discovered it was actually a prison, explained a longtime friend who was among the few allowed occasional visits. By the time he realized it, his social muscles had atrophied. He'd forgotten how to just be with people. The extent of Carson's reclusiveness surprised even those who had known him for decades. He declined invitations to major industry events, reunions with former colleagues, and even prestigious honors. When he was inducted into the Television Academy Hall of Fame in 1987, he didn't attend the ceremony, a pattern that continued with subsequent recognitions. There were at least a dozen major tributes planned for Johnny after his retirement, and he turned down every single one, noted a former NBC executive. It went beyond introversion or privacy. It was as if he was actively trying to erase himself from public memory. As years passed, however, Carson began to express misgivings about the walls he had built around himself. He maintained subscriptions to entertainment industry publications and would occasionally call former colleagues to discuss shows or performances that had caught his attention, brief connections to the world he had left behind. In one of his most revealing moments, Carson sent a handwritten letter to a former producer around 2001, 3 years before his death. The note, later described by its recipient, included the poignant observation, "I made millions laugh, but most nights I sit by myself." This growing awareness of the costs of his isolation led to small changes in Carson's final years. He began having dinner more regularly with a small circle of friends, occasionally ventured to restaurants near his Malibu home, and even considered a limited return to television, though his declining health ultimately prevented this. Johnny's greatest regret wasn't professional at all, reflected his longtime friend and attorney Henry Bushkin. It was that he had constructed a life that looked perfect from the outside, but left him fundamentally alone. He built walls to protect himself from public demands, then found he couldn't figure out how to lower them when he wanted to. Act 3. Resolution. These 10 regrets reveal a Johnny Carson far more complex than the smooth television host who entered American homes 5 nights a week for 3 decades. Behind the familiar smile and perfect timing was a man who struggled with intimacy, held grudges fiercely, missed opportunities both professional and personal, and ultimately found himself isolated by the very boundaries he had created to protect himself. What makes Carson's story particularly poignant is the contrast between his extraordinary success and his private discontents. He achieved everything he had professionally aspired to: wealth, influence, respect, and enduring cultural impact. Yet these achievements existed alongside failed marriages, strained family relationships, professional misjudgments, and ultimately, a solitary retirement that bore little resemblance to the connected life his viewers might have imagined for him. Perhaps the most revealing insight comes from Carson's own words in one of his rare post-retirement conversations. When asked if he missed The Tonight Show, Carson reportedly replied, "I miss the applause. I miss the confirmation of what I'm doing, but I don't miss the burden." This tension between needing connection yet finding it burdensome, between craving affirmation yet fearing intimacy, defined Carson's contradictions. He was a man who made millions feel they knew him while remaining unknowable, who brought joy to countless homes while struggling to find it in his own life. In the end, Carson's regrets humanize the icon. They transform him from the flawless television host preserved in our cultural memory to something more authentic and ultimately more valuable, a talented but flawed individual whose struggles and disappointments mirror our own, albeit on a much grander scale. The true legacy of Johnny Carson isn't just his perfect comic timing or his skillful interviews, but the complex humanity that lay beneath them, including the roads not taken, the relationships not mended, and the regrets he carried until the end. Like Carson himself, it's a legacy both entertaining and melancholy, filled with brilliant achievements and quiet sorrows. A reminder that even those who seem to have everything often look back wondering what might have been.